This video was a doozy. In March I rolled credits on 6 whole games as part of my 2026 challenge to beat as many games as I can from my back catalogue. From the bright colourful fantasy of Spyro Reignited Trilogy to the moody, foreboding, grim-dark world building of Bioshock. I had a lot of variety in my experience, but I found one unifying question that tied all of these games together in one theme. A question I want to present to you, the viewer, before I take you on my journey for the month. What is it about becoming powerful in games that appeals to you the most? Is it the feeling of mastery, or is it improving the power that you have earned? Do you chase ever greater enemies and challenges, or do you return to where you started to take revenge on what once was a struggle? Personally, I've always drifted towards the latter. The most rewarded I feel in a game after gaining power is in going back to early areas to revel in my newfound dominance. For example, I love returning to the opening area in Resident Evil 4 on New Game Plus, with an arsenal capable of dismantling a small country, now singularly aimed on the hapless Ganados that once overwhelmed me with chainsaws, blissfully unaware of the walking apocalypse about to descend on their tiny village that made me feel like a helpless weakling. That kind of catharsis never gets old. Through my gaming in March, I experienced many versions of the power fantasy and catharsis, and I found myself interested in how these games present that fantasy and offer it as a reward to dedicated players. I came to appreciate that the so-called power fantasy in gaming was, well, pretty powerful. We all play games for different reasons, but power is one of the strongest motivators of all. We all relate to the rush of bigger numbers popping up when we hit an enemy with a newfound legendary weapon, and that feeling of power and dominance is a great tool that games use to reward and delight players to keep them glued to their screens for the next big dopamine hit. In modern gaming, progression leans heavily into the illusion of power, showing bigger numbers and higher stats, but they fall largely flat in the actual game feel. Thanks to live service design and level scaling, modern gaming struggles to actually make us feel meaningfully more powerful for all the time invested in the game. When a base enemy takes the same amount of attacks to kill, what does it matter if you do 1 damage or 1 million? It's vital that players feel rewarded for their time invested in a game. If the rewards fall flat, your entire motivation for playing the game and gaining mastery disappears. Why bother to get stronger or grind for higher level gear if I'm going to wind up no more powerful than I was at the start of the game? The opposite extreme lands just as hollow though. If it's possible to complete the break progression by grinding a few obvious stats to become an unstoppable monster from early on, progression loses its meaning entirely. The key then is somewhere in between, to achieve a sense of continuous, meaningful growth where power is earned over time, and where said growth impacts game feel, and not just numbers are bigger. My gaming in March showed me many sides of the power fantasy in games, how it can be used to great effect to motivate, to tell a story, to make gamers feel both the delight of victory and the despair of defeat. Some games left me feeling like I had risen to their challenge, getting to feel a catharsis of mastery and fluency in a final crescendo, where I met the threats head on. Other games simply allowed me to play out my power fantasies, no questions asked, just plug in and enjoy the feeling. While doing my experiment, I kind of realised that I tend to enjoy older titles more because I'm already kind of familiar with their design language. That familiarity means that I can get to the point of catharsis and power fantasy a lot more quickly. I mean, it goes without saying that we enjoy things more when we're good at them, but I came away with a deeper appreciation of how the games use the pursuit of mastery to keep me hooked and coming back for more. The answer to the question then of what about the power fantasy appeals to me most is this. I enjoy achieving mastery through my own effort and then experiencing it firsthand through how my gameplay is different from when I first started. To demonstrate, let's look at the games that I played in March 2026. When I started this experiment, I was intending to avoid buying new games, but I'm a long-term Resident Evil fan, so this game had to be an exception. My history with the series goes all the way back to the originals in the 90s, where the fear was almost too much to bear for my childhood nerves. Now I'm older and wiser, I can handle the horrors a lot more capably. Resident Evil overall, it represents a satisfying payoff to the game of power fantasy for me. Initial playthroughs are tense, with scarce resources and overwhelming enemies pushing you to your very limit in every encounter. And then on subsequent runs, your knowledge and skill flip the dynamic in your favour. Now you're the overpowered force. At its core, Resident Evil really has always been about confronting fear and then rising above it. Resident Evil Requiem builds on the power fantasy and catharsis by splitting into 2 distinct gameplay styles between 2 protagonists. Grace's sections represent sort of the new normal of Resident Evil, especially with modern survival horror, with tense resource management and careful exploration through dense puzzle box environments. The fear itself is exceptional too. Requiem features some of the most terrifying sequences in the entire series, but Leon on the other hand is like the complete opposite. he's a bombastic, cathartic power fantasy of action hero proportions. There's a really good section of catharsis in the care centre where the game sends you through the same space that you snuck through fearfully as Grace, but now as Leon, the script is flipped in your favour as you tear through the map like you are playing Doom. You're no longer trapped in the room with monsters, they're trapped in the room with you. On subsequent playthroughs, the experience of growth and power deepen, and you can even play the Grace sections with just as much fluency as you had playing with Leon. I just wanted to mention before moving on though that there are some technical issues where the frame rate drops into the low teens, even on an Nvidia 3070 with frame gen on, but there are special moments where the visual fidelity is genuinely so astonishing that these drops feel worth it. Outside of those awkward drops, I managed a fairly decent 90ish FPS throughout. Resident Evil Requiem is a strong expression of the power fantasy, built around the idea that strength is earned through skill and progression. Its greatest catharsis for me is in the moments where, thanks to all the upgrades that you get both in game and in skill, players get to turn their newfound domination against once terrifying zombies. It really reflects why this style of design resonates with me so strongly. My satisfaction comes from having earned the ability to wield overwhelming power, not just from being given it. That said, Resident Evil Requiem is an 8 out of 10. Alien vs Predator is actually quite an intriguing power fantasy proposition. I mean, simply playing as a xenomorph or predator is quite compelling in its own right. However, it feels a bit too imbalanced in favour of a player at times, which breaks a bit of suspension of disbelief as you feel so strong that the core fantasy kind of undermines itself. My main issue with how AVP tackles the power fantasy is in how the Marine campaign stretches the believability of the game. The best strategy for dealing with xenomorphs is often melee combat, undermining the threat of the iconic aliens. I played Alien Isolation, where even just one creature is just this gigantic, imposing monster, and being able to suddenly trade blows with one like I'm Rocky Balboa, it feels absurd. It's satisfying in the moment, but it breaks the suspension of disbelief, which raises a question for the power fantasy in gaming: at what point does it go a bit too far? However, the game redeems itself because it lets you play as both a predator and a xenomorph in their own campaigns, particularly when you get to play as a predator. Getting to wield an extensive sci-fi arsenal, it makes you feel invincible as you jump through the map with thermal vision, optical camouflage, and you're preying on marines that are helpless to your overwhelming onslaught. Playing as the predator is pure fun. You're an unstoppable, invisible killing machine, feared by humans and xenomorphs alike. So here, Aliens vs Predator kind of presents the power fantasy of gaming through just pure wish fulfillment. You want to be an unstoppable sci-fi killing machine? Here you go. The result is a lot of fun, but it makes progression feel a little bit shallow. While Resident Evil makes you earn your catharsis, Aliens vs Predator simply just gives you the tools you want, which is a valid approach, but it's just not one that quite reaches the same heights. With all that said, this is a good game at its core. It was released to middling reviews in its day, and it was a disappointment at first, especially given the series' pedigree. I remember 2001's Aliens vs Predator 2 was a beloved cult classic. As an FPS, this game is shallow, but there's an honesty in how it plays. At 7 hours, it's a straightforward campaign, and it doesn't offer anything deep, but what it does well. It helps that performance-wise, it is an incredible showing. It's well over 400 FPS throughout. I mean, it doesn't surprise me as a 19-year-old game, but the point is still there. Alien vs Predator was interesting as the wish fulfillment side of the power fantasy equation. It lets me play as a xenomorph and a predator to feel a sense of overpowering superiority, while getting to play some of the greatest movie monsters of all time. In comparison to Resident Evil Requiem though, I'm kind of getting an understanding that I like to earn my power in video games, not just to be given it for free. Overall though, I'm pretty happy with AVP as a good, honest video game. While I do recognise its numerous flaws and shallowness, it was still just a competent video game. 6 out of 10. At this point, I realised that I played mostly grim dark FPS titles for my experiment, so I decided to swap out the brown-grey colour palettes for something bright, cheery and fantastical, and a different gameplay genre entirely. That's why I landed on Spyro Reignited Trilogy. The point of this experiment after all is to experience the breadth of my library as a fuller experience. It also helps that I well and truly adore Spyro the Dragon. In terms of the power fantasy topic, I would say that Spyro is less relevant than other titles featured so far. Pretty much, I just wanted to play a nice 3D platformer. However, I do have one useful observation from Reignited that made me reframe my view on player empowerment: the use of Super Flame as a reward in Spyro 2. That observation is, what happens when you don't want a progression reward? Having already completed Spyro 2 a couple years ago, I opened a new game to find that Super Flame was unlocked at the start. It turns out that Spyro 2 permanently turns it on when you first complete the game for all subsequent playthroughs. Luckily, there's a workaround involving putting in a cheat code, but there's the rub. I was inputting a cheat code to actively reduce my power in the game. Why would I do that? It's because I was hoping for more of a pure experience and to play the game as if I was booting it for the first time. But it is interesting that I had access to what should have been an overpowered ability, but instead chose consciously to forgo it because I wanted to experience the game in its fullest, most nostalgic form. Perhaps there's an emotional observation to be had there. Maybe, like Aliens vs Predator, there's a sense that leaning too hard into certain power fantasies in gaming can almost dilute the identity of a game if it breaks too much. Or maybe there's something in the mentality that making the game too easy for yourself, you're somehow cheating yourself out of a wider, more pure gaming experience. At any rate, I've realised that feeling stronger in general is perhaps not as engaging a reward as I might think. Sometimes I just want to experience the game in its original state, on its own terms. At any rate, once I was playing it as intended, Spyro Reignited Trilogy was an incredible game to revisit. It's a cliche, but it really is like playing an interactive animated movie. You get a real sense that the developers were not limited by technology whatsoever in their vision, and just made the best looking game that they wanted to make. And on modern hardware you can easily achieve over 100 FPS with all the settings cranked. It runs amazingly, though some platforming sections are helped by capping the game at 60 FPS, and I would highly recommend that you do so. I have a lot of nostalgia for Spyro, and it brings a tear to my eye to revisit the Dragon worlds from my childhood. Every layer of the game is made with charm and craftsmanship, and I love that in Spyro 2 and 3 you get to talk to a wider cast of characters, all with their own motivations, often comedic in nature. My favourite will always be Spyro 3 because of its no bad ideas approach to game design. Some moments even involve skateboarding in the ultimate 90s campy throwback. It's a charming experience throughout. I was also really moved by the credits sequence, where the art shows the various adult dragons raising Spyro as part of the family. It was super wholesome. As far as gameplay goes, Spyro is almost a cozy experience. You get to adventure at your own pace, and the design emphasises the joy of exploration for exploration's sake. It helps that the world is so jam-packed with attractive visuals that you can't help but want to explore and take it all in. As an early 3D title, occasionally the platforming feels janky, but as the game is primarily designed as a collectathon, the weakness of the harder sections is mitigated by the fact that they're often not that hard or even critical to the overall game. Really, putting aside this video's topic, Spyro was just a fun game that I enjoyed playing, and I would happily do so again. I do think at some point I want to do a full review to do this trilogy justice. There is a lot to unpack here. Because it's a trilogy, I decided to average out my enjoyment score for all 3 of the Spyro games in the package, which came out as an 8 out of 10. Now here is a game with some real layers to unpack. Bioshock is a mainstay on lists of the greatest games of all time, and for good reason. The world design is breathtaking and still among the best that the genre has ever produced. This game made the case for video games as an art form when it first released in 2007. As a story, a piece of art and a game, everything about Bioshock represents the medium at its absolute peak. However, before moving on and while avoiding spoilers, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not going to force any jokes or references involving that overused phrase that shows up in almost every Bioshock discussion. It's been talked about enough. However, if you have never experienced the central twist, it's a genius piece of game design that is still impactful to this day. I'm not going to spoil it here, so do play it for yourself and you'll understand exactly what I mean. If you know, you know. I have a complicated relationship with Bioshock in 2026. Mechanically, it feels a little bit clunky. As a pure FPS, the gunplay lacks a lot of precision, and the hacking puzzles get old really quickly. Mercifully, they're skippable using collected resources. At the same time, there is a real depth to the systems of the game, thanks to the plasmid abilities and how the game lets you customize your skills and abilities to fit your own playstyle. But the game shows signs of being really dated in its animations. The character animations are uncanny in their motion. It was a product of its time. I do recall there were many issues when they animated 3D models like this back in the Xbox 360 days. But then you look at the world of Rapture and it is mesmerizing. There hasn't been a gaming world to this day that captures that same sense of place and atmosphere, and the underwater city is an imaginative concept that even impresses today. In terms of the power fantasy, Bioshock is closer to Resident Evil. Your growth is earned. At the start you're a vulnerable interloper, barely scraping through encounters, but by the end you're a spliced up monster capable of taking on anything the game can throw at you. Primarily, gamers are rewarded for deep exploration and engaging with Bioshock's systems. For instance, hacking offers more than just cheaper resources, but it also directly benefits you in combat. Hacked health stations become traps for your enemies. Security cameras send mobile turrets to support if it detects a hostile, and even the iconic Big Daddies can briefly be used to your advantage. The power fantasy comes from being able to twist a combination of plasmids, environmental hazards and hacked defences to your advantage. When things synergise perfectly, you're practically an unstoppable force. That's where the power fantasy is at its best. It allows you to express mastery and rewards you for engaging completely with what the game has to offer. By the end of the month, Bioshock revealed to me what makes a good power fantasy reward in a video game. To be truly satisfying, player upgrades should not just be about granting strength for strength's sake, but to be integrated into the wider design. The power fantasy isn't merely given, but it emerges naturally from engaging deeply with every layer of the game as a whole. It's about encouraging players to learn the game as a whole and then let them express that dominance. Bioshock, though, is overall a game where I admire it more than I enjoy it. I know this is a game that is critically revered and it made strides forward for the industry. Don't get me wrong, I didn't dislike the game by any means. I can really appreciate the artistry and the craftsmanship, and I recognise this as a truly defining title. But really I found the gameplay was just a bit too floaty, and overall it was just not as satisfying as other games. That's not to say it's bad by any means, it is an important landmark title in gaming. I just didn't enjoy it compared to other shooters of its era. Bioshock is a 7 out of 10. In the end, what makes me feel best about getting good and the power fantasy, it comes from a sense of having earned it. But also, in that earning it, I am playing the game at its highest level. It's like playing a piece of music to its full potential. When I get to the point that I can express true dominance in gaming, I enjoy it greatest when that dominance comes from being not only earned, but from having truly engaged with the game. I am motivated heavily by catharsis, and games use that to great effect as a motivating reward. There's a reason that I love booting up New Game Plus on Resident Evil 4 and humiliating the Chainsaw Ganado. I would even go so far as to call it a revenge mechanic, and I find it incredibly satisfying. Looking back at my games in March 2026 then, I experienced the full breadth of how games handle progression and rewards. Resident Evil Requiem's replayability, skill growth and upgrades created a meaningful arc from initial fear to confidence, and then eventually to mastery and skill expression. Aliens vs Predator showed me that there was a delicate balance. If you were too capable, it could break immersion, especially if that capability clashes with the game's identity. But then through how it handled the Predator and Alien campaigns, it does show that sometimes it's best to just give players what they want. Spyro Reignited Trilogy on the other hand was more of a relaxing palate cleanser, but it still taught me that sometimes if you provided an overpowered play reward, it dilutes the identity of a game's experience. And finally, Bioshock brought everything together. It's tied up the narrative of power progression in games by demonstrating that the best catharsis tends to come when it's woven into the entire fabric of the game design. By using that power fantasy to encourage players to fully engage with the breadth of the game, to create and then reward that sense of progression and capability as a climactic expression of fluency. We all play games for different reasons, but for the majority of us it comes down to feeling good. That often means feeling powerful, and so the power fantasy is a vital part of what motivates us. The promise of the next legendary weapon to one-shot your foes, the flow state of absolutely effortlessly breezing through combat, revenge fantasy of humiliating enemies that once gave you trouble. After playing 6 games in March 2026, I gained a deeper appreciation of how games enable us to experience the pure joy of player empowerment, and I hope that through this video that you did too. Thank you so much for joining me on this video essay. This one was huge. I think it was a mistake to brute force my way through 6 games like that. It took ages to get the writing down to a reasonable word count. By the way, here are some stats on my 2026 journey so far by the end of March. The total time played was 89 hours. The total size of all of my games was 271 gigabytes. The average age of my games was 10 years old, and I've played a total of 10 games. My most popular genre so far is FPS, with 4 of the titles played, and my average game rating is 7.6 out of 10. As always, please do all of the usual YouTube stuff. I really want to grow this channel out and take things a bit more seriously, and every like and subscribe helps me make that goal a reality. I'm having a great time with these videos and learning a lot along the way, so I would love to keep getting lots of feedback, comments and discussion. If you got this far, why not tell me your favourite power fantasy moment in your own game? I would love to hear from you. All that said, let me say again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!